Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and it's time for part 2 of the Q&A, so let's go ahead and knock this out. Alright, first question. Hey Jason, a buddy of mine just hit the intermediate numbers. Do you think I can make him do a 3x5 on squat, bench, pull-up, press, and maybe some triples on the deadlift for the entire next year to achieve the strength standards you laid out yesterday? Personally, I use concurrent, but he doesn't want to train more than 3 times a week. That's a great question. I mean, take a look at what I'm doing right now during my cut, right? And I think this is going to preserve muscle for me pretty good. We're going to find out come next DEXA scan how well this is going to work for doing that. And I'm going to see, how that goes. But if I can preserve muscle mass doing essentially that, there's no reason an intermediate can't gain muscle doing that, and strength, obviously, with some basic progressive overload. So, talking about squat, bench, pull-up, press. You do all 4 of those with a 3x5 every week, 3 times a week, and then throw in a little bit of deadlifting. I think you'll be fine. Deadlift or power clean. And I might even say you can get away with singles on the deadlift, have him do some singles. Again, depending on if you're going to work with hook grip or what it is you're doing. But yeah, I mean, in order to hit those numbers for an intermediate over the next year to hit my target numbers, if he reached the other stuff, I think you're realistically probably going to need to not run just like a 3 lift type thing like a lot of programs. You're going to need to do all 4 of those in, maybe with the deadlift added in. So that's what I would recommend for a full body. Again, I think it can be totally done. I think you can do it with a 3x5 as long as the progression and recovery is there and enough training volume is there. But like I said, I think you're going to need all 4 of those lifts on each of the full body workouts if you're going to do 3x5 for an intermediate, and you're going to need to put the deadlifting in on top of it. The deadlifting is going to be just kind of the trickiest one to always program in when you're doing that many lifts, and do it at the end. Very similar to what you see me doing. I mean, you could use what I'm essentially doing as a base template with some micro loading and resets and things like that, or occasional lighter day. I think you could totally do that and get away with it, and it will be perfectly fine. I think it'll be perfectly fine for what he's doing and what your goals are with him. So yeah, I think it can be done. It's just going to be a matter of, is the programming on point with it? Is his rest, recovery, nutrition on point with it? Those are going to be your big factors. You're going to need to make sure you nail all of those. All right, next question. Is it possible to gain more muscle than fat on a bulk instead of the 1-to-1 ratio? For example, could someone gain about 5 pounds of muscle while only gaining 2 pounds of fat? That's what my body scan shows I gained, and I was on an empty stomach, so I know it wasn't just food weight skewing the results. If I really did gain this much muscle, then I attribute it to actually counting my macros and making sure I hit a surplus on most days at least. Factor to keep in mind, I'm still in my early 20s and only recently started to make a lot of gains. All right, brother. Yeah, I mean, you're in the demographic to where you can pull this off. Also, again, you just started to make a lot of gains. You're probably making some new gains. And you didn't give me your time frame for that, but I'm going to say that for novice lifters, and if you just now started making a lot of gains, you are a novice lifter. You're a novice lifter, no matter what you may have think you did before. So, that being said, you're in the demographic that can pull this off. Now, here's where you have guys like Ripto who will come in and they're right, and then you'll have guys like Jeff Cavalier both right. It's a question of how fast do you want the gains. In other words, someone could pull off what you're doing and make pretty good gains in certain time periods, right? 5 pounds of lean mass is what it shows. Now, keep in mind, some of that's going to be transient storage factors. Some of that's going to be muscle glycogen, which is going to be more water and everything else. You've got to keep that in mind. So you could stay leaner and pull that off with good gains as a novice, or you could make great gains by gaining it at a higher ratio. In other words, had you been willing to gain a pound of fat for every pound of muscle at that point. And I'll talk later about that, guys. That's stuff that we need to really talk about, of what our limits are there as far as health and everything. And I think someone asked that in a later question, so I'll be able to delve further into that. But you might have been able to gain 7 pounds instead of 5 pounds of lean mass. Does that make sense? Had you been willing to put on 14 pounds of body weight instead of 7, you might have gained 7 pounds of muscle instead of just 5, but you would have gained, again, 5 pounds of extra fat to go with that with a 1-to-1. So that's what it comes down to. Are you trying to gain muscle and strength as quickly as possible and then trim it off later? Or are you okay with keeping your body composition roughly similar? Because I can tell you right now, 2 pounds of fat gain with 5 pounds of lean mass, your body composition didn't change negatively. In other words, if you were at 14% body fat, I promise you, you're under 15 still, right? With that sort of gain. And it has to do with the fact that you're a novice still in a lot of ways, and in your early 20s, those are enormous factors. And then closely tracking your diet is always going to be the key to controlling your gains to some extent, right? And it's not that you track your macros. All right, I'm going to get this out of the way. Your macros don't mean shit for your muscle gain. They don't matter. Your protein and your calories are what matter. Fat and carbs, they only matter for that tiny last 1 to 2% of what you're trying to do with body composition. In other words, whether you're choosing to do fat or carb calories on a given day are nothing more than fine tuning. They are going to affect your overall body composition changes less than 5 to 10% of your total change, right? They're largely irrelevant within certain reasonable limits. The protein and the calories is all that really matter until we start talking about those last percentages of gleaning that tiny little edge, right? Which is why for non-competitive athletes, it isn't that big of a deal to worry about whether calories are coming from carbs or fat on any given day. Again, barring trying to glean that tiny, tiny little difference. That's why I'm not a big fan of the macro tracking. I don't think it matters for 99% of lifters, but the protein and calories do. All right, next question. Hey, Jason, when you recently mentioned natties should not be afraid to bulk up for a longer period of time if they want to get as big as naturally possible, what body fat percentage did you have in mind exactly? Now, there we go. That's getting to that question that we can lead into from the previous question. So, I mean, it's good timing, and I think I picked it that way on purpose down the list. So, here's what I would say on that. Realistically, and this is, again, I'm not practicing what I preach here. Let me get that out of the way. I am not practicing what I preach. You guys saw me go up to like 25, 26. I was probably 27% body fat at the highest peak in the last year, right? I'm going to be realistic here based on my DEXA scans and fat loss before, and I bet you I hit 27%. So I am guilty of not practicing what I preach here, but moving forward, let's be realistic. If you care about your health at all, and you're trying to maximize muscle and strength gain and all that stuff early on, even as a natural, I think up to 20% is permissible. 20%, no medical doctor on earth will say that a physically active young man that they will suffer any health benefits from going to 20% body fat. Guys my age, all right, if you're my age, this is possibly true. It's possibly an issue, right? We need to be more concerned with that going up to 20%. Healthy young men, you might be able to squeeze out 25, but I'm going to say realistically, because if you're going to trim that fat off later, you do need to be aware that if you go much higher, you're going to lose more muscle as a result. So I'm going to say up to 20% body fat. 20% body fat is totally acceptable for a very active, healthy young man to go to while bulking, trying to maximize gains. Don't be afraid to go to 20%. Beyond that, we could argue there might be some health compromise and it's not worth it. And remember, 20% you can always cut down to an athletic body fat relatively easy from there. It's not going to be that bad. You can retain muscle pretty good, but you're going to end up probably bigger as a result. If you slow bulk for a long period of time up to 20% as a natural, and you really maximize those gains off of that, when you cut later, you're going to be bigger than if you hadn't done it. So that's, I think, realistically, that's probably around a ballpark for our practical cutoff. All right, next question. Thoughts on using instinctive training, doing away with programs and percentages? I think other than for a few individuals, that is dooming you to failure. That's almost worth its own video. I don't want to even talk about the concept of instinctive training with exercise selection. If you're doing that and you actually think that's a good way to do things, you're probably borderline mentally handicapped. So I'm going to leave that one alone. It's too asinine to address. But instinctive numbers, rep ranges, weight on the bar, stuff like that, instead of percentages, I think that's going to depend upon the individual. Let's just call that what it is. That's very subjective. For a novice, if you're in your first year, maybe even your second year of serious lifting, and you do that, you are probably going to fail. Let's just call it like it is. It's stupid. It's going to be a waste of time. If you're a late intermediate or an advanced lifter who has a fair amount of training experience, you've run a couple different programs, you know what you're doing, you understand how the body's stress recovery adaptation cycle works. Could you do a loose pattern on that? Yes, that's technically what I'm doing kind of at this point, isn't it? Right? It's not really a set in stone pattern on the weights on the bar and my percentages and stuff. It's not. You can get away with that and probably be very successful at it. However, the majority of lifters at any given time, probably even 90% of people coming to YouTube Fitness for training advice are not in that category. So I can say, just objectively speaking, this is going to be a path to failure for 90% of people listening if you started doing it now. Now, you keep listening and you guys keep running properly set up programs. Maybe in a year or 2 years from now, you're no longer going to be in that situation, and you're going to be in that 5 to 10% of the demographic of lifters who now have the tools to successfully do that. And I'm not saying you couldn't develop those tools by just doing it that way, but you're going to probably spin your wheels a lot over the next year or two with the learning curve if you try to do that. It's not going to be a quick path to success. You'll get there eventually probably, but it's not going to be the fastest path to success. You're going to end up needing to resort to drugs a lot faster to get anywhere, because that's how most drug guys train, and that works for them because they're on a ton of gear. All right, guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time in part 3.